So we'll probably just start in about 2 minutes. People are still joining, so we'll just give it another minute or so.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, I think we'll get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this month's Lunch and Learn, featuring an overview of GRIDS 2. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Make sure that you remain muted during the presentation. As far as questions go, we are going to allow about 20 minutes at the end of the presentation to do some question and answer. You have two options. We're not going to use the raise hand function. What we're going to do is if you have a question that you'd like us to pose to the presenter, just type your question into the chat, and Jennifer Roth will compile those questions and ask them of the presenters at the end of the presentation. If you would like to pose a question directly to the presenters, you can just type in question into the chat, and Jennifer will also be keeping note of that, and she will call upon you in order at the end. So I guess I think we should move on, and I'd like to welcome Senior Project Manager Heather Travis, as well as Planner Lauren Vrates to begin their presentation.
Excellent. Thanks, Gord. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us on your lunch break today for the GRIDS 2 and Municipal Comprehensive Review Lunch and Learn. As Gord mentioned, my name is Heather Travis, and I'm a Senior Project Manager in the Policy Planning and Zoning Reform section of the Planning Division, and the project lead on GRIDS 2 and the Municipal Comprehensive Review, or MCR as we call it. Joining me today is Lauren Vrates, planner in the Policy Planning and Zoning Bylaw Reform section, and an integral part of the GRIDS 2 team. We're excited to share information with you today on our long-range city building project, which is planning for the next 30 years of Hamilton's growth and shaping the future for Hamilton to grow as an economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable city of the future. So here's a list of the topics that we'll be covering today. Lauren and I will take turns covering the different topics. And when we're finished, as Gord mentioned, we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. So before we get into the details about GRIDS 2 and the MCR, let's start at the highest level. What we're talking about today is growth management. So what is growth management? Growth management is a strategic, long-range, comprehensive, and integrated approach to planning and city building. It incorporates infrastructure planning and investment, demographic and economic forecasting, employment trends, and land use planning. Growth management evaluates where, when, and how we will grow. It plans for where people will live, and it plans for areas where people will work and businesses will establish. Growth management includes studies and master plans, targets and forecasting, and potentially urban boundary expansions. However, it encompasses so much more. The city is well positioned to manage growth in a fiscally responsible and forward-thinking manner. On the slide before you are a number of different initiatives that are currently underway within the city and are all linked in some way to growth management planning. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but together they are intended to have a positive impact on the city's growth. The document that provides significant policy direction for us on our growth management planning and for all other municipalities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe is the Provincial Growth Plan, called A Place to Grow. The growth plan was most recently updated in 2020. The growth plan provides direction to municipalities that we are mandated to follow and incorporate into our growth management exercises. Some of the matters that the growth plan provides direction on are the planning horizon or year that all municipalities must plan to. In the most recent update to the growth plan, the province extended the planning horizon to 2051, whereas previously it had been 2041. And therefore we, along with all other municipalities, are now planning for a 30-year timeframe. Population and employment forecasts. The plan includes a schedule that provides forecasted population and employment for all Greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities in 2051. And Lauren will speak to Hamilton's forecasts in the next slide. The growth plan also identifies minimum intensification and density targets that municipalities must plan to, and we'll speak more to those later. And the plan also identifies criteria for urban boundary expansion. The plan provides a list of matters that municipalities must address and evaluate prior to considering an expansion of their urban boundary. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren now, who's going to help us look forward and consider the Hamilton that we're planning for in 2051.
So as Heather mentioned, the growth plan has identified a planning horizon of 2051, meaning that through GRIDS 2 and the MCR, we're planning for the next 30 years of the city's growth. The growth plan also provides the population and job forecast that the city must plan to accommodate. In Hamilton's case, the growth plan forecasts the city to grow by 236,000 people for a total population of 820,000 in this timeframe. Accommodating this population growth will require an additional 110,000 new dwelling units to be added to the city over the next 30 years. For employment, it's forecasted that Hamilton is expected to see an additional 122,000 jobs by 2051 for a total employment of 360,000 jobs. As for the graphs on the slide, this is a significant amount of growth for the city to be planning for. In fact, in terms of population growth, the amount of people that Hamilton will be planning for is equivalent to adding the cities of Guelph and Niagara Falls combined to our urban area over the next 30 years. So 30 years is a long way out. What will the city look like then, and how will it function in that time? In terms of population, Hamilton will be more diverse as immigration will continue to rise. It'll be more populated. As mentioned, the city is forecast to grow by 236,000 people and 110,000 dwelling units. It will have a population that lives longer, as life expectancy to the year 2046 is expected to increase from 84 to 88 years for women and 80 to 86 years for men. Our population will be older, as the mean age will increase from 39.6 to 42.9 by 2051. And we'll have smaller household sizes. The average persons per unit will go down from 2.51 to 2.37. Populations will grow by 41%, but households will grow by 49%. In terms of climate, we expect Hamilton will be warmer, with an average annual temperature increase of 5.1 degrees. Hotter, the number of hot days will increase, days above 30 degrees Celsius will increase from a mean of 16 to a mean of 30 days. Wetter, the annual precipitation will increase by 66.7 meters in a high emission scenario for the city. And wilder, extreme and heavy rain events become more frequent and intense. In terms of technology, it's anticipated that we'll have a rate of approximately 95% of vehicles being electric, that there'll be more autonomous vehicles, that will experience more automation in the workforce, and that will rely more on smart technologies in the future.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So we've talked now a bit about growth management and the Hamilton of the future that we are planning for. So let's turn our attention now to GRIDS 2 and the MCR, and what exactly GRIDS 2 and the MCR stand for. So GRIDS 2 stands for the Growth-Related Integrated Development Strategy, and it's a long-range planning process and growth strategy that will direct population and employment growth in Hamilton to the year 2051. The first grid study was completed in 2006 and planned for growth to the year 2031. So we're now updating our growth strategy to extend out for another 20 years to 2051. GRIDS 2 is integrated with other major city initiatives, such as updates to the city's infrastructure master plans, a transportation network review, and ultimately the development charges bylaw update. At the same time as we're working on GRIDS 2, we're also completing a Municipal Comprehensive Review, or as I mentioned, the MCR, as we often call it. The MCR is a provincial requirement to update the city's urban and rural Hamilton official plans to conform to the updated provincial plans, including the growth plan and also the Greenbelt plan. Like GRIDS 2, the MCR also plans to the year 2051, so we've combined these projects into one integrated planning process. So the slide on the screen, if you can see it okay, shows the various studies and requirements that we'll be addressing as part of the GRIDS 2 and MCR study, and nicely illustrates the overlap between the two projects. Through both projects, we need to review the city's residential intensification, supply and demand, review the city's employment lands, incorporate updates to the city's master plans, and include a fiscal impact assessment. GRIDS 2 includes the requirement for a land needs assessment, which we'll get into more detail in the next section. And the Municipal Comprehensive Review includes the official plan review and updates to both the urban and rural Hamilton official plans. And the combination of both of the processes combined is the submission of an official plan amendment to the province for approval, which will implement the study recommendations, including any requirement for urban boundary expansion and the official plan review. And I just want to stress again that GRIDS 2 and the MCR is truly an integrated process. Through this project, we're working closely with staff in other divisions and departments who are responsible for other ongoing city initiatives, including the water, wastewater, and stormwater master plan updates, a transportation network review, recreation and parks master plans, community energy and emissions plan, and ultimately all of this work will feed into the next update to our development charge bylaw. The projects are iterative and complementary. The determination of where and how the city's growth will be accommodated will inform the studies that you see on the screen. In turn, information from these studies and projects will help to inform the GRIDS 2 and MCR evaluation process so that we can ensure we're appropriately addressing all potential impacts of the city's long-term growth. And just finally on our project process, the slide on the screen shows the different phases of the GRIDS 2 and MCR project. We began with a review of background information and the completion of several different technical background studies. Phase 3 was the completion of the land needs assessment, which was a project milestone, and Lauren's going to provide you some more details on that next. And while the land needs assessment has been received by council but not yet approved, we are moving into the final phase of our project, which is the evaluation of where and when the city will be growing, including any potential urban boundary expansions, and we'll speak more to that later in the presentation.
So as Heather mentioned, a recent project milestone was the completion of the land needs assessment, which we often refer to as the LNA. The city's LNA was completed by the consultant firm of Laureus and Associates. The LNA is a technical study that helps us determine how we can plan for population and job growth and whether or not more urban land is needed to accommodate a portion of the population or jobs over the next 30 years. Community area land need is considered separately from employment area land need in the LNA. Community area lands are primarily residential, but also include some jobs in the form of institutional and commercial uses and some offices. Employment lands are areas in the city used for industrial facilities and business parks. The LNA is a technical and mathematical exercise that must follow a method that is set by the province, known as the Provincial Land Needs Assessment Methodology. The methodology takes a market-based approach to the determination of land need. This means that municipalities are required to plan for a range of housing unit types to satisfy future market demand, including detached and semi-detached homes, secondary dwelling units, townhouses, and a range of apartment types. This slide shows some of the major inputs into the LNA that ultimately influence the outcome of the LNA and whether or not the city will require additional urban land to accommodate growth. On the community area side, which you will recall refers to the areas of the city that are planned for primarily residential growth, but also institutional and commercial job growth. There are two key inputs which influence the overall land need. These two inputs are the intensification target, which refers to the number of new dwelling units that are constructed within the built-up area each year. Heather will talk more about intensification in the next section. And the other input is the planned density of the development areas, and we'll provide more detail on density later in the presentation as well. On the community area side, these two inputs strongly influence the results of the LNA and whether or not the city will require an urban boundary expansion to accommodate future growth. And it's important to note that while the LNA methodology is set by the province, the inputs and assumptions related to the intensification target and the planned density can be determined by the city and provide us with some flexibility on the determination of the overall land need. On the employment side, employment area land need is calculated based on the city's existing supply and forecasted demand for employment area lands. Once again, employment area lands refer to the city's business parks and industrial areas. After completing the calculations in the LNA for both community area and employment area growth, if additional land is required to accommodate a portion of the city's growth, this is referred to as an urban boundary expansion. The LNA does not identify where the city's urban boundary would be expanded, but rather the LNA only identifies how much additional land is needed.
Great, so let's focus on intensification now, because as Lauren just noted, the amount of intensification that the city plans for has a huge impact on the future requirement for potential urban boundary expansion. Intensification refers to the development of land in the urban area at a higher residential density than what currently exists. This can include redeveloping a piece of land for more uses or units, or development of brownfield lands, former industrial or commercial lands, developing vacant lots or underutilized sites, infilling projects on smaller sites, secondary dwelling units, and expansion or conversion of existing buildings. Development in the form of intensification has many benefits, including less land needed for the development of greenfield areas, more opportunity to use infrastructure like roads, sewers, and water in an efficient way, placing more people in areas where they can access transit, and providing opportunities for a variety of housing forms in one neighborhood so that there's a mix of unit types available. This is helpful if people want choices for housing during their life cycle that are within the same area of the city. So when we talk about intensification and the intensification target as an input into the land needs assessment, we're referring to intensification in a provincial growth plan context. So when the growth plan speaks to the intensification target, it's referring to the number of new dwelling units constructed annually within the city's built-up area. And the built-up area is shown in red on the map on the screen and corresponds roughly to the city's already developed portion of the urban area. So the growth plan measures intensification as occurring within the built-up area, and the plan sets a minimum target for the city to achieve of 50%, meaning that each year, a minimum of 50% of all new dwelling units must be constructed within the built-up area. Now that target is a minimum, and the city may plan for a higher annual intensification target if we deem it to be appropriate for Hamilton. So how has Hamilton been performing in terms of yearly intensification rates in recent years? The graph on the screen indicates the city's yearly intensification rate every year over the past 10 years. As the graph shows, the city's intensification rate has fluctuated on a yearly basis since 2011. This variation is to be expected. The intensification rate is calculated based on the number of building permits issued for new units in the built-up area each year. And it's expected that the number of building permits issued will vary from year to year and will continue to do so in the future. A single large multi-residential development in the built-up area can have a significant impact on the yearly rate. As seen on the graph, the city has averaged an intensification rate of approximately 38% over the past 10 years. But in recent years, the rate has been increasing, with the city achieving a high of 57% intensification in the year 2020.
So we also mentioned density earlier as another factor that has an influence on land need. Density is measured differently from the intensification target. It's measured in persons and jobs per hectare of land. Density is measured in the city's designated greenfield areas, which is the part of the city's urban area that is not in the built-up area. It is shown in white on the map. Also, any lands that may be added to the urban area in the future would also be considered part of the DGA. These lands are shown conceptually in blue on the map. The density at which the city's greenfield areas, including new expansion areas, will develop can have an impact on overall land need. The higher the density of development in new areas, the more units can be accommodated in less area, and the less overall expansion land will be required. The growth plan has a minimum target of 50 persons and jobs per hectare in the designated greenfield areas. The city's existing designated greenfield areas are forecast to develop at a higher rate than this, closer to 60 persons and jobs per hectare. And looking at any new expansion areas and how they develop, we have some flexibility in how densely we assume those areas will develop in the future. Housing unit mix and how densely units are built influences the overall DGA density. This really gets into the question of what do we want our new communities to look like in terms of unit type and form? So together, the intensification target and the planned density of new growth areas work together to set land need. As intensification and planned density increases, required land need or expansion area decreases. This is a very direct relationship. As the city plans for more of its new housing units to be developed in the built-up area, the number of units that need to be planned in the expansion areas decreases, and therefore the overall urban expansion land need decreases. Similarly, as we assume that new greenfield areas will develop at higher densities, the overall land need will decrease as we are fitting more new units into a smaller area. But we want to remember that as we are looking at different scenarios or options related to intensification and density targets, we need to remember that there are many impacts to consider and not to be focused solely on the impact of urban expansion land need. As we plan for more or less intensification and higher or lower densities, we need to consider the impacts on housing mix, transit accessibility, climate change, servicing, and fiscal impacts, among other matters. Growth management is all about planning for the city to grow sustainably, equitably, responsibly into the future. So we need to keep a big picture view as we plan for the future and make decisions and recommendations. So I'll now pass it over to Heather, who's going to talk about some of the results. Yeah,
thanks, Lauren. So we mentioned earlier that the city has completed its land needs assessment to plan for growth to the year 2051. With regards to community area, or primarily residential land need, the land needs assessment modeled several different scenarios using different assumptions related to intensification and density targets, which resulted in different requirements for urban expansion land need. Staff are recommending the scenario in the land needs assessment, which we call the ambitious density scenario. And it's based on a future intensification rate that averages 60% and gradually increases from 50% in the short term to 70% in the long term, and a planned density of 77 persons and jobs per hectare in new expansion areas. These targets are ambitious and represent greater rates of intensification and density than the city has experienced in the past. The resulting land need, or urban expansion need, from this scenario is approximately 1,340 hectares of land to be added to the urban area to accommodate future population growth to the year 2051. Of the 4 scenarios that we had modeled in the land needs assessment, the ambitious density scenario resulted in the lowest requirement for urban expansion land need. And so we've been focusing a lot on the community area land need side in this presentation, with our focus on intensification and density. But we do want to note that the land needs assessment did also examine the city's employment area land supply. With respect to our employment land need, which as you remember is in land needed for industrial uses, manufacturing, logistics, and business parks, we know there's a forecasted growth of 122,000 jobs coming to Hamilton in the year 2051. The LNA for the employment lands takes into account the different industrial areas in the city, such as the Bayfront Industrial Area, newer business parks like the ones in Flamborough and Ancaster, and specialty areas like the Airport Employment Growth District and the West Hamilton Innovation District, and considers how much job growth each of these areas is likely to accommodate until 2051. Basically, we need to know if the city has enough existing employment lands to meet the needs of businesses over the next 30 years. And so what the LNA found was that there will be a demand to accommodate 112,000 jobs within our employment areas, and that the current employment land supply can accommodate roughly 114,000 jobs. So the demand and supply for employment land are roughly in balance. And in fact, we have a small surplus of employment lands available, equating to about 60 hectares. So in summary, the land needs assessment has identified that the city does not need to add any new lands for employment areas over the next 30 years. So we know that the LNA has identified a requirement for the city to expand its urban boundary to accommodate residential growth by about 1,300 hectares in the staff recommended ambitious density scenario. And we mentioned earlier that the land needs assessment identifies the amount of land needed, but does not identify where or when the lands will be added to the urban boundary and be developed. The question of where and when the city will grow its urban boundary is the subject of the next phase of our project. So the city is limited in its options for where it can consider urban boundary expansion to an area of lands that we refer to as the White Belt lands. So the map on the screen shows you a portion of the city's urban area, which is shown in gray on the screen, and the lands shown in green are within the Greenbelt Plan protected countryside. So they're rural and they're within the Greenbelt Plan. The city cannot expand its urban boundary into the Greenbelt Plan area, with a very limited exception for a minor expansion from Waterdown or Binbrook. Other than that, the city can only expand its urban boundary into lands that are not within the Greenbelt Plan area. So on this map, the lands that are not within the Greenbelt Plan are shown in white and blue. The lands that are shown in blue are lands that cannot be developed for residential uses in the future due to noise restrictions from the airport. You'll see the purple line drawn on the map, and this is the 28 noise exposure contour line from the airport. And no new residential uses are permitted to be developed in that area to protect the operations of the airport into the future. The blue lands then, within that 28 exposure contour line, could only be used for employment uses in the future. So the areas in white are the areas that we refer to as the community area white belt. And these are the only areas that the city can consider for future urban boundary expansion for community or residential uses. The white belt areas are generally in the vicinity of Alfreda, that you see the block to the east. The lands in the center we refer to as the 20 Road East lands. Lands in the 20 Road West and Garner Road area, which are the smaller blocks north of the airport. And then there's a block of land south of the airport in the area of White Church Road. So the net developable area of these community area white belt lands that you see on the screen that can be used for future residential uses, and by developable area we mean excluding natural heritage features and cemeteries, etc., is about 1,600 hectares. Comparing that number to the recommended urban expansion amount of 1,300 hectares, you can see that the city will not require all of the white belt lands to accommodate growth to 2051. So the next phase of the process that we are currently in is the evaluation of where and when the city will grow. We know that the city's options for where the urban boundary can be expanded are limited to the general white belt areas that we just showed you. So a great deal of the discussion in this next phase will be considering how these new growth areas will be phased. We know we don't need all of the land for development immediately. The land need is phased over time. So how do we determine the order of development of these new community areas? With the assistance of our consultant team, we have drafted an evaluation framework and phasing principles to help us make these determinations. The framework will cover several theme areas that you see on the screen, including impacts of growth on agriculture, climate change, transportation, and servicing infrastructure. Using the complete communities theme as an example, we can review how the development of complete communities is considered as an expansion area, is considered as an evaluation tool in the phasing of new growth areas. Can a proposed expansion area function as a complete community with an appropriate mix of jobs, housing, services, transportation options, and public service facilities for all ages and abilities? And can a proposed expansion area contribute to the completeness of the existing land surrounding it? These types of evaluation questions will help us to make a determination of where the city where and when the city should go, and a preferred phasing order for which lands need to be developed in the first growth phases.
So moving on to the final topic that we'd like to cover today, it's climate change implications. The city has declared a climate emergency and set a goal to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. We therefore need to ensure that we are using a climate lens as part of the evaluation for GRIDS 2 and the MCR. In considering climate change lens on what we've talked about today, there are several considerations to be made. Planning for increased intensification and planned density will have the impact of focusing more growth in the existing urban area, which has the benefit of creating compact urban growth and increased opportunities for active transportation and transit use. Supporting a scenario in the LNA, which would result in a lesser need for urban expansion lands, will allow for the increased preservation of rural and open space lands. Applying a climate change lens at this stage would suggest pursuing intensification and density targets at the aggressive end of the spectrum is preferred. This approach is reflected in the ambitious density scenario of the LNA, which staff are recommending. The city will have an opportunity to plan for new communities that reduce climate change impacts and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are resilient and adaptive for future change, including the establishment of a transportation network that supports active transportation and transit, alternative energy options, compact form, and a mix of land uses, protection and preservation of open spaces, and the existing tree canopy, and other opportunities. These considerations will be evaluated as part of the next phase of GRIDS 2 and the MCR, and through future secondary planning processes.
Great, so that about wraps up our presentation. Currently, we're working along our project timeline that you see on the screen. Right now, the phase that we're at, we are conducting a mail-out survey at the direction of Council to all households in Hamilton, asking for their opinion on the land needs assessment and which scenario should be supported within the land needs assessment, including a potential option to not expand the urban boundary. We're also currently conducting consultation through the Engage Hamilton portal on the evaluation framework and phasing criteria that we will be using to evaluate growth options. And we're aiming to identify a preliminary preferred growth option to identify where and when the city will grow in the fall of this year. So thanks for listening to our presentation today, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Heather and Lauren. I learned a lot, and I've noted down quite a few questions, and I'll start right back at the beginning, reading them out from the chat. There was a question on whether the population growth is for Hamilton proper or the whole CMA.
The population growth is for the city of Hamilton as defined. So the old city of Hamilton and obviously all of the former municipalities and not the CMA.
Okay, great. A second question was, have these population growth projections been accurate in the past? And is there a lot of confidence in these projections to 2051? I'm assuming that's in reference to the provincial projections.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when we started out in the GRIDS process a couple of years ago, we did actually do a kind of a look back to see how the city had been performing in its growth over the past 10 years against various different targets that had been set. And one thing we looked at was the provincial growth forecasts. And what we did find was actually on the population side, the city was pretty much on track with meeting up till that time, which was about 2018, 2019 that we were looking at that. We were on track with meeting the provincial growth projections. We were very close. I can't remember off the top of my head the exact number right now, but we were very close. What we found though was on the employment side, because we also have the job forecast from the province, is that we were very much behind. We were not meeting the different targets on the job side that the province had established, but that was not unique to Hamilton. All municipalities across the greater Golden Horseshoe were behind on the job side, with the exception of Toronto, which I think it was something like by 2016, they had already met almost their 2031 job target. So basically all the jobs that had been forecast to be spread more evenly across the Greater Golden Horseshoe had really been concentrating in Toronto, and that hadn't been predicted to the extent that it had materialized. So on the job side, we were behind. We have confidence that that's been addressed now in the forecast going forward. The province did a review of the population and job forecasts when they released the updated 2019 growth plan. They had a consultant team called Hemson Consulting who specializes in forecasting, and they did a lot of work and a lot of consulting and a lot of research to update the forecasts going forward. So they updated to 2051, but they also provided some numbers that cities can use as preliminary forecast to 2031 and 2041, some kind of benchmarking targets that we can look to on the way to 2051. And they seem more realistic for Hamilton to achieve than the old forecasts that we were planning for. So I would say there's more confidence now on going forward on both definitely on the job side, and that the projections out to 2051 seem realistic for Hamilton as well on the population side.
That's great. A very fulsome answer. Thank you. Now, another question related to the 100,000 dwelling units that are forecasted to support the growth target to 2051. I think you kind of touched on this in the presentation, but maybe you can revisit it quickly. But the question was whether existing residential and built-up areas have been considered, so for the redevelopment of surplus commercial parking lots and other opportunities for residential intensification has been factored into the growth targets and assumptions.
Yes, most definitely. So when we are considering where and how we're going to accommodate intensification now to 2051, at that 60% target, it equates to about 66,000 dwelling units to be accommodated through intensification over the next 30 years. We certainly make assumptions that a portion of that growth will occur on sites like you mentioned in the question there, on commercial parking lots, in other commercial establishments, you know, older shopping centers that perhaps want to redevelop and add some units on top or within a portion of the parking area. That there will be redevelopment of not only vacant sites, but also there will see opportunities for redevelopment of areas that maybe we haven't been seeing as much of in the past, and commercial plazas is intended to accommodate certainly a portion of that growth. The commercial and mixed use zoning that the zoning team put in place a couple of years ago really adds some flexibility to allow for more redevelopment of areas, of different areas in the city to accommodate some of our intensification, as does the new downtown zoning, the zoning along our transit-oriented corridor, so the future LRT line. All of that zoning is very flexible and promotes mixed use. So we do assume that certainly a portion of our intensification, a large portion, will be accommodated in areas like that.
Great. Thanks for that summary again. A question coming from our transportation planning team is the 60% average density, so that residential intensification target that the city was discussing, put forward to council, I guess it was. Is that in keeping with other GTA municipal projections? I guess the question is, are other areas seeking to exceed that 50% target that the province is set for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I certainly don't know all of the other Greater Golden Horseshoe municipalities, and some of them haven't necessarily landed on a recommended target yet. I do know, though, that certainly many, I could safely say many municipalities are looking to go beyond that, the 50% minimum. I don't know, though, you know, what the highest that anybody's pushing it is. We are planning for 70% intensification in the latter half of our planning period, which is 2041 to 2051. And that's certainly much higher over that 10-year period than we've ever experienced in the past. So we feel that we're pushing it pretty high with that recommendation. I believe Halton is also making a higher than the minimum recommendation. They're not at the point yet where they've landed on an approved target yet. Toronto, obviously, all of their growth is intensification, so it's not as relatable. Peel, I think, hasn't landed on a target yet. So everybody's still, even our target is not approved yet because this council has not actually approved our land needs assessment yet. So we're still in the recommendation phase. And that's really where a lot of municipalities are right now, is looking at options. But I would say we're seeing more of a trend toward going above the minimum than just planning for the minimum.
That's reassuring. We're keeping up with our neighbors. Okay, another question, and this is more geared toward the employment lands. Was automation of warehousing and the development of those larger footprint warehouses, was that taken into consideration with the projection of the employment lands until 2051?
Yes, so that would have been taken into account in the updated forecast from the province when they looked at the job side. They looked at the future of employment and did some work around that to determine, what's the impact of, as you said, automation, the warehouses, all these huge, massive Amazon warehouses that we see popping up in different places. What is the impact of that on our overall job growth? They even did some work, and I'm not an expert on the forecast or exactly how they're prepared. That's very technical, but they did take into account, or tried to, as much as they could, take into account impacts of COVID on demand for office space, for example. So, it's very much a guessing game, and nobody knows exactly what the impacts, particularly of the pandemic, are going to be. But yes, those different trends that we're seeing going forward were taken into account in the forecasts out to 2051.
That's great. And I had a question, so I'm going to jump the queue a little because it's about the employment land. Does the surplus that you noted about that 60 hectares, is that going to be converted to another land use or remain in employment?
Maybe I'll let Lauren speak to that, because her project focus right now is on employment land conversion.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So we have identified a surplus of 60 hectares, but so I think it was about 2 years out. It was before I started the city. There was a request for a public request went out for request for potential conversion of employment lands, and so that was where people who have employment designated lands at various business parks and industrial areas across the city can make requests for the city to review their lands and potentially redesignate those lands for non-employment uses to allow potentially some mixed use, basically to allow uses that wouldn't be that we wouldn't have foreseen in the employment area, to remove them from the employment area. We can only do that at this time through the Municipal Comprehensive Review. So we have had some people come forward, some individuals come forward, landowners who have requested that we review if their land should be included. And we do have a report coming up in June, mid-June, to GIC that's making some recommendations about which lands would be considered for conversion, which lands wouldn't be considered. And then also the staff have identified some conversion areas, and those are areas that perhaps they've been considered part of the employment area, and maybe perhaps they're only residential. They've only been residential, and they're only going to continue to be residential. And areas like that don't make sense to be part of an employment area anymore. So in that sense, yes, we do have a report coming forward, and the 60 hectares, we do anticipate that some will be converted to non-employment uses, but at this point we don't have a final recommendation. So, and we have some that we're going to be deferring as well, and those ones are just more complex files that we have to wait for more information on before we make a decision.
Okay, that's great. That's interesting. I'll watch for your report. Thank you. Okay, another question. Will the density per hectare along priority transit utes, so the BLAST network, be higher than 70 persons and jobs per hectare, or will it stay at that?
Yeah, so the density of 7, well, yeah, so in our new greenfield areas, we have a target established of 77 persons and jobs per hectare. In our existing greenfield areas, it's a bit lower. It's 60 persons and jobs per hectare. But that particular density target, it's only measured in the areas that we refer to as the designated greenfield areas, so not within our built-up area. If you recall the difference on the map, the built-up area is the area where the intensification target is measured. So there's different measurements that we apply to different areas of the city, and that's required by the growth plan. So we don't actually have a measurement particularly along the blast route. Any measurements within the greenfield areas are measured just across the greenfield area as a whole. We don't, it's citywide. It's not measured by individual development or individual area of the greenfield, of our designated greenfield area. But on the intensification side, because much of the blast network would be measured, we'd have the intensification target would apply there. We can provide breakdowns of the amount of intensification that's predicted along our corridors versus within the downtown, other nodes. We have that breakdown, so we can certainly, and that's something that will be provided as we go forward when we finalize our different numbers and we get our targets approved by council. So we do have that breakdown of anticipated development within different geographic nodes and corridors of the city.
Okay, I guess that would lead me to ask, when you have those additional breakdowns, will that potentially lead to policy changes in the official plan and changes to zoning to assist in increases in density?
It certainly would require change or would result in official plan updates because the targets and we currently have targets in our official plan for, just as I was speaking, density targets in different areas of the city. So we'll look at those and see what needs to be updated as a result of our work. Whether or not it will require any zoning changes, we don't know at this stage. As I mentioned, the zoning is all very current and it's already quite flexible. So I would say it's doubtful that any zoning changes would be required. Certainly, though, zoning changes will be required to implement the employment land conversions that Lauren was speaking to. But in terms of within our different nodes and corridors, it's pretty up to date already.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from the chat. Are there any agreements already in place for residential development with respect to the white belt areas?
Well, not sure I would call it agreements, but through the first GRIDS process, which I mentioned was finished in 2006, that process had identified the Alfreda lands as the city's next growth area, and that's on the Stony Creek in the area of Upper Centennial and Rymal. That the Alfreda had been identified to accommodate a portion of the city's residential growth out to 2031. That was implemented into our the city's new official plans at the time. But the decisions or the implementation into the official plans was appealed by various different parties for different reasons. And anyway, the long story short, that's still all under appeal. So Alfreda has not, it's not part of the urban area, it remains rural. And so we are reviewing now, essentially with a clean slate through this process. We are looking at all of the different white belt areas equally and evaluating going forward which makes the most sense for the city to develop, which areas make the most sense to develop and which make the most sense to develop first. So, you know, there's a lot of history with the Alfreda area, but we are evaluating all white belt areas equally.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Sorry, Jennifer. Yeah, sorry, it's George Zajac, Heather.
Hey, George.
So,
What's George's question?
yeah,
Yes.
I sort of meant for the white belt west of Lancaster, because as you know, I was taken a bit by surprise in an LPAD hearing with respect to the white belt lands across the street from McGarner Road. LPAD hearing that there was, and maybe it wasn't sort of more of an MOU, as you say, but there was an agreement with the city and the landowners that those lands become residential. I think that's more of what I was pointing to.
Yeah, so there was, and again, we're kind of getting in the nitty gritty here, but the lands that there's 3 smaller pockets of white belt area that are north of the airport. There's a piece on Garner Road, like George mentioned, and then a couple of blocks on 20 Road. 20 Road West. Those lands initially had been part of the Airport Employment Growth District and had been planned for employment uses at the time that the airport secondary plan was approved. Again, kind of long story short, due to appeals by landowners, when the secondary plan was received final approval at the Ontario Municipal Board at the time, those lands were left out and were not included in the urban area for employment uses. And there was a memorandum of understanding that said that through the next Municipal Comprehensive Review, the city would review whether or not those lands should come into the urban area and for what use. So there's no agreement that they absolutely will come into the urban area. There's an agreement that we would be reviewing them through our process, which is what we're doing right now, along with the 20 Road East and Alfreda lands as well.
Yeah, thanks, Heather, for that clarification. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, great. A question regarding whether the employment forecasts that are specific to Hamilton are available for internal use outside of
Yes,
planning.
it's a public document, the
Okay.
background forecast from Hempson. And if people are interested, I'm sure I can arrange to have a link sent out. And it provides all the assumptions that went into the forecast and then the forecasts for each of the municipalities separately.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heather. Keep the questions coming. We've got a few more minutes. There's one more question in the chat. Are non-market housing units included in the province's market-based housing forecast? And I assume market and non-market housing are included in the definition of a life cycle of housing and housing mix. Big question.
Yeah, that is, sorry, I don't know if you can hear us screaming in the background. That's my my daughter
No, we
talking to her. Okay, I can.
Oh dear.
Sorry, the provincial forecast doesn't, it just breaks down housing units and then housing unit by type, single and semi-detached, row houses and apartments. It doesn't get into any other differentiation. So, it's more high level than that. But we certainly do consider the different, market and non-market housing as being part of the housing mix and important for the full life cycle of housing options.
Okay, great. Any last questions from the audience? Just feel free to unmute yourself if you don't want to type it into the chat. I'm not seeing anything else in there.
Hi, Heather. I have a question, if I may. It's Sue Remack.
Hi, Sue.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks. Jennifer, is it okay that I jump in here?
Get going. You're good.
I'm just curious about the calculation for the surplus lands for the employment areas. The reason I ask is, as you're aware, a good chunk of the AEGD has been purchased by some pretty large-scale developers who have plans to develop as soon as the servicing becomes available. So were those calculations based on what the province has stipulated for their calculation, the 70 persons per hectare, or did we look at the developments that are coming on board? Like, would this mean the AEGD, we don't anticipate it to be fully developed by 2051?
Yeah, so good question, Sue. And so what it means is we anticipate that the AEGD, as it's currently delineated, will be fully developed by 2051, but it will not be expanded beyond its current boundaries. So if you remember or recall, before the AEGD secondary plan was approved, there was a larger study area that was identified as potentially forming the employment area. And then it was kind of through the secondary plan approval and some more work on land need, it was determined that only a portion was required to accommodate the growth, and that's the secondary plan that as you know it today. And there's always been a thought that the remaining lands that had initially been identified would be a future second phase of the AGD. What we've
Right.
determined through this process is right now, to the year 2051, we do not need that second phase to be added to the AGD, but that the existing secondary plan area as defined will fully develop by 2051, as will all of our other business parks. There's vacant lands in many of our other business parks. They will develop. There will be some intensification within the business parks. Certain areas like the Bayfront and the Stelco site will see intensification there. So those are the assumptions that went into that calculation of our employment area and the determination that it's essentially in balance right now.
Okay. I'm just, because the only thing that if I could add is that I think what has really changed for the city of Hamilton, at least I'll speak for myself, if not for economic development, is, you know, for quite some time, we were accustomed to seeing these expansions, if you will, on the industrial side of things, you know, 50, 100,000 square foot. You know, the Maple Leaf Steel was a big deal. Those are becoming commonplace. So the inquiries that we're getting in now are, you know, 500,000 square foot to 1 million square foot. Those are the ones that are coming in that are kind of commonplace. If I just look at the Amazon structure itself, if I look at the building footprint, the person's jobs per hectare just on that one development alone, I'm not saying they all will be that, will be about 150 persons per hectare. So I'm just putting that in there, Heather, that the just to make a comment that the types of development in the industrial areas has changed drastically. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sue, and I'll pass those comments on to our land economist, who Anthony Lorius, who did the work for us. I do know that he had several conversations with Norm over the time he was preparing it, but it certainly is, yeah, it's important to hear that and to know that, as you said, trends are changing in our employment areas, and it was something that we tried to capture. But I'll pass along your comments nonetheless.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that kind of just wraps us up. I think
Yep.
Gord wanted to do some last closing.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we're just right on time here. So I just want to thank Heather and Lauren for the presentations. Great presentation, lots of great information. I also want to thank everyone for joining us. Nice sunny day out, and everyone's here, so appreciate that. And also special thanks to Jennifer for moderating the questions, and for Christina for managing the chat, and for her technical expertise. So they will be getting a follow-up email, which will provide resource links to GRIDS 2, as well as a recording of this Lunch and Learn. Our next Lunch and Learn will be June 3rd, featuring a presentation on fishing by IT. Any suggestions that anyone has for future Lunch and Learn topics, please email them to myself, Gord Mackey, and I'll wish everyone a great afternoon, and talk soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.
We'll wrap it up. Bye.
Great
Bye.
presentation. Thank you so much.